Hi, it's Lisa Van Gemert. I'm so excited to be live tonight and share some answers to questions I've got. So I received a number of questions, and for the people who submitted questions, I'll be answering those, but I also will take questions in the chat. So if you have a question, please feel free to put it up there. I'm going to open this up on another computer so that I can make sure that nothing crazy is going on. Normally, my husband is monitoring stuff when I'm teaching kids on YouTube, but today it's just me. So super excited to be here. The first, well, you know what I should do is introduce myself a little bit. I'm Lisa Van Gemert, and I'm known in the internet as, and in gifted land as the gifted guru. But really, the name of it is less that I'm the gifted guru and more that I'm trying to help everyone to be a gifted guru. So if we haven't met yet, it's nice to meet you. And I hope that you'll say something in the chat and welcome to you. I will go ahead and start that chat off. So the first question I had was pretty, I thought it was an interesting question because I think it's a real issue. And it was, this is what the question said. Our district is working hard to become immersed in PLCs. And if you're unfamiliar with that terminology, it's a professional learning community. So this is when groups of teachers are working together. And she says, this work has shifted our role as gifted and talented teachers so that we're being asked to support teachers even more with extending standards. And we're glad that teachers are noticing that there are kids who have met the standards even before they teach them, right? We need that to be a t-shirt. And that they want our help and expertise, finally. But this hyper focus on standards comes with some challenges. For example, we're seeing some questioning and pushback about why some identified kids are identified and need services when they haven't met some standards. We are working to help classroom teachers and instructional coaches understand how thinking skills can fit in with standards. And if they think about this up front, it will help all learners. Sorry for the long explanation. And here's the question. Do you have any advice for the best way to serve TAG students and their classroom teachers within PLC schools? So here's my answer. I think it's important for teachers to understand three concepts. And I think that whether you are a parent or whether you are an administrator or whether you are a TAG teacher or instructional coach, these three things are where we start in onboarding teachers who are less familiar with gifted into this world. So the first concept that I think it's important to understand is the concept of asynchrony, that these kids are unlevelly rising. Right. And I sometimes I use the metaphor of like the Panama Canal, and that when a ship is going through the canal, they will put it into one of the locks and then raise it up and then move it and raise it up. And if you looked at the Panama Canal from a side version of it or a side view of it, you would see that the canal is doing this. Right. And I think, or another metaphor that sometimes works is if you see the like stereo bars when you're using a music thing, and there are the different levels of, bass and treble, and that our kids are doing this. And it's important for teachers to understand that just because a student is advanced in one area doesn't mean they'll be advanced in all areas. And asynchrony, probably number one thing for people to understand. This gets tied up not just in content, but also in like executive function, right? Like, well, sure, the kid can do the 10th grade math, but they don't have the executive functioning skills to handle it. Well, that's because of the asynchrony. And welcome to those of you. Thank you for posting the chat. It's making me so happy. This is the very first time that I've done this, and I just got the idea and decided to go for it. So I'm so grateful to those of you who are with me now. Okay, the second important principle for teachers is that it's about what they're capable of thinking within the standard. So we don't necessarily need to get caught up in whether or not they have mastered this standard and not that standard in deciding whether or not to offer them differentiated services in this standard. What we need to consider is what thinking are they capable of doing in this standard, aside from whether they've mastered another one or not. Too many teachers get caught up in what are we what are we doing instead of what are we thinking? And so one of the things that's important for them to understand is that it's important to focus on what thinking are these kids capable of in the standard. So, oh, Lindsay, welcome from Memphis. I just love Tennessee so much. And okay, Laura Weaver, I think you know how I feel about Ohio. I always say this. I got this line from Brian Housen, who probably got it from the internet somewhere, but it was like, Ohio, 75% vowels and 100% awesome. I have a very, very, very good friend. One of my closest friends is from Ohio, and she has taught me so much Ohio stuff. Okay, the third step to understand is that we want to help teachers understand is that GT kids do not follow a linear path. Karen from Denver, I heard you guys like had a snow day. My friend Colleen Ehrlich, who is a principal of an amazing gifted magnet school there, texted me yesterday and said they were snowed in. So welcome, and welcome from New Jersey. I have only been in New Jersey one time. I have been to a town called Allentown, New Jersey, not Allentown, Pennsylvania, but Allentown, New Jersey. So welcome, and thank you, Laura, that Ian sent me over. Ian and I were just messaging a second ago. So GT kids don't follow this linear pattern, right? They don't follow this linear pattern of recursive learning like we're used to. Like you learn how to add, and then you learn how to subtract, and then you learn how to multiply, and then you learn how to divide. What they do is they learn that something like a cell, for example, like, oh, something such as a cell exists, right? Like their second grade teacher says, oh, there is this thing called cells, and we're going to learn about, cell walls. But the GT kid is often not interested in learning what the teacher is trying to teach about it. They're not interested in that, but they will go read a college biology textbook, right? So there's this difference in their interest level, and sometimes the on grade level concepts don't interest them. And then what we end up with is what is often disparagingly called gaps, right? Where they understand, complex cell structure and can give you a 30-minute lecture on the role of mitochondria, but they don't actually know the difference between the structure of a plant cell and an animal cell. So they can get messed up that way. And if we understand that, then we learn an important truth, which is that when we're trying to make sure that our gifted kids are learning those fundamental principles that they need, we have to make sure that we're using what we know about giftedness to capture their attention. And gifted kids are often interested in the esoteric. They're interested in the unusual. They're interested in the trivia. They're interested in the backstory. Now, of course, I'm speaking in generality. Wanda from coastal North Carolina. Wanda, I am flying on Wednesday to Wilmington, North Carolina. I'm taking my daughter and my two little baby granddaughters to go see my other bonus daughter and her son, who live in, they actually live in just outside of it, like in Holly Ridge or something, but right just outside of Wilmington, North Carolina. So I will be there. Okay, the second part of my answer here, this one is the longest answer, but the second part of my answer is that to address this in boots on the ground classroom practice, and if you're just joining in, the question was, how do we handle it when teachers are concerned because a gifted kid hasn't met certain standards, but yet we want them to advance in standards? So so that's what we're addressing. So one of the things we need to look at is the standard that's being taught, does it have a prerequisite standard? Meaning, did you have to learn X before you learn Y? If not, no problem, right? If not, why are we worried about that? We need to let kids advance to the level they can if there's no prerequisite standard. If there is a prerequisite standard, it's fine to expect the gifted child to master that standard before moving on. That's absolutely fine. So I think one of the things that teachers are looking for is reassurance and confirmation that it's okay to have expectations of gifted kids in learning. Now, the third thing is that I'm going to throw out another metaphor. I think metaphors help us all understand. So I try to help them imagine that you have a track team and you're the coach of a track team. The coach isn't going to make an athlete raise their long jump distance before they're allowed to go work on their hurdles time. right? They're totally unrelated. So a track coach is never going to do that. And one of the things that can hurt is if teachers are seeing themselves more as gatekeepers of the standards rather than coaches in the strong event, right? So I think probably that's the most important thing I'm going to say tonight, is that when we're teaching gifted kids, we have to see ourselves as coaches in the strong event and not gatekeepers of the standard. And if we can change that mindset, then it opens up just a totally different paradigm. It's a paradigm shift, right? I'm not going to worry about whether or not they've met this standard unless it's a prerequisite in order to let them think at the level they're able to in this other standard. The next question, and if I'm answering your question and you have a follow-up question about it, please throw it in the chat. Or if you have another question, please throw it in the chat. The next question was, I'm worried about this virtual learning, specifically the impact on kids who need differentiation. My daughter was multi-screening during most of the day and still getting A's. Very frustrating. Oh, yeah, I feel your pain. So there are a couple of competing interests here. The first interest is the teacher, who's most likely overwhelmed. This has been a really difficult year for many teachers. And then at the same time, distance learning isn't really meeting the needs of the vast majority of learners. And this is not just a GT problem. So I have friends who have kids who are typical learners, and they're still like, they're done and it's 10 o'clock in the morning and they're just, treading water all year. And it's devastating. So what do you do? Well, here's my suggestion. My suggestion is to send an email like this to the teacher. Actually wrote an email. Hi, thanks so much for all you're doing in this challenging situation. It's always important to acknowledge the work that the person is doing, especially when they're, underpaid and overworked and struggling, right? I see the comment that some kids have thrived during distance learning because they've had more time to devote to their interests. The difficulty is that sometimes their interest is video gaming and they're not actually learning. And the other problem is that they're getting into some bad habits sometimes. So yes, it can be positive for some kids, but I think overall it's posed a challenge. A lot of people have gotten out of the really good habits of schedules and working with other kids and patience and taking turns, and all of those things are really tricky. So it's a two-edged sword. Okay, so thanks so much for all you're doing in this challenging situation. You're appreciated, right? I'm noticing, and that's where we start. Use that phrase. I'm noticing. I'm noticing. It's not threatening. I'm noticing that my daughter is able to get A's without really giving an A's worth of effort. I'm concerned that she's going to develop poor habits like multi-screening or tuning out. And I'm wondering if there's a way to give her a little more challenge to keep her mind fully engaged during this learning experience. Thanks so much for all you're doing. So if you'll notice, I never said you. I never used the word you. It all is about what you're noticing and why you think it's a problem and what you're hoping might be able to happen. That's reasonable, right? It's reasonable for a parent to say, I'm wondering if there's a way to give her a little more challenge, right? So that is what I would do. I would reach out to the teacher. I would also, that's the first thing, I would also make sure that I am focusing on some of the good study habits. And this is something that parents have got to do. I recently was doing a virtual parent meeting, and a parent was complaining that the teacher wasn't forcing the student to turn on the camera. And I said, well, in my state, this teachers aren't allowed to force them to turn on the camera, but you are, right? You're the parent. So I think a lot of this has to fall on the parent. And I understand that, we've generally expected the schools to educate children, but in the current situation that we're in, if the child is learning from home, which hopefully will be ending soon, right? Hopefully this won't be a thing. But if a child is learning from home, then it it requires that the parents also enforce good habits. And that wasn't really this particular question, but in general it is. And Laura's making the comment that the students' bad habits are not being able to study complex work anymore. They're slacking and having trouble getting back to the challenge work. And I think we're going to see that. I think partly it's because reading comprehension on a screen is much more difficult. And we're going to have to get better, even if we're doing virtual learning, we're going to have to get better at melding distance and analog, even when we're virtual, meaning that we're going to have kids reading on paper and not on screens. And I think what Laura is seeing, which is the habit of they're just not spending time on assignments because they're used to just trying to whiz through it. I think that is a common thing. I don't think Laura is alone there, and her students aren't alone. Okay, question 3. Oh, this question, I feel like this question could be an entire book. All right, the question, but don't worry, I'm not going to give you a whole bunch. The question was, do you have any specific tips for a child who is struggling to work within a group due to the following? Difficulty accepting when she has answered a problem wrong and/or has made an error, which results in her being unkind to other students in the group. So do you understand the dynamic this parent is saying? Or this isn't actually a parent, it's the gifted teacher who's trying to help, a resource teacher. And what the child is doing is when the child gets frustrated with being wrong, the child lashes out at the other kids in the group. Next, a struggle with flexible thinking and accepting other viewpoints, right? So they only want their idea, right? And is often easily annoyed by others, so would prefer never to work in groups. And I always joke about this, right? What is a gifted kid's preferred group size? That would be 1, right? I know she needs to learn empathy, but parents and teachers are asking for specific strategies. Any advice would be welcome. So if you're the asker of the question and you're with me tonight, thank you so much for this question. I think that group work is one of the main challenges of gifted kids. When I was the Youth and Education Ambassador for Mensa, we surveyed the teenagers in Mensa. So we surveyed the kids from 12 to 18 and we asked them, what is your most difficult thing in school? And 100% of them said, 100% of them said working in groups. So this is a thing. Yeah. Yeah, so Laura's saying this is a good question, right? And it is. Okay, so there are actually, I gave a lot of thought to this and I've written a lot about this. And so I hope that this answer will be helpful. So we have to look at 3 different aspects to this. We have the child, obviously, who's at the focus of this question. We also need to look at the structure of the group, and we also need to look at the other members of the group. So let's look at all of those things. Okay, the structure of the group. I've written about this on my website, and I still hold to my stance, even though I got a lot of hate mail about it. I think most teachers do group work all wrong. Oh, Lynette, I'm so glad you're here to hear the answer to the question. Be sure to ask a follow-up if I don't answer it thoroughly. Okay, so I think most teachers do group work all wrong. And I think that that is the root cause of most gifted students struggle with group work. Now, I'm gonna address all the other aspects too, but I think we have to start with that. I've written about it, and here's the most important thing that needs to be in place is that teachers must structure groups so that no student is responsible for the work of another student, and no student's grade is dependent upon the work or lack of work of another student. Right. So let me say that again, just to make sure that I'm clear and everybody understands what I'm saying. When group work is done in a classroom, my grade should not depend on whether Susie does her work or doesn't do her work. And I should not be responsible for whether Susie does her work or not, right? So I need to make sure that I'm responsible just for my own. Yes, together but separate. I think it sounds crazy because, like, aren't they supposed to be working collaboratively? But collaboration doesn't necessarily mean that I'm writing in your handwriting, holding your pencil, right? So if a teacher has structured the group so that our grades are dependent upon the work or lack of work of another student, tension will be high. And when tension is high and stress is high, kids are not going to be their best selves, because even adults aren't their best selves in that situation. So fix that first. Make sure that the group itself is structured appropriately. Because if it is, then the tension will be lower. And even if those aren't the issues that the specific child is having the group structured well will lower the stress in the group. All right. The second aspect of it is the other members of the group. Students need to be given some guidance in how to respond when a student in their group is having a meltdown or being unkind. And this can be done as a whole class. It isn't that a teacher needs to go to a small group of kids and say, you know, I know Lucy's in your group and she's super hard to work with. So when she throws a fit, what I want you to do is this. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is, as a whole class, before working in a group, a teacher can say, you know, sometimes when we work in a group, we get embarrassed because our answer's wrong, or we have a hard time accepting someone else's answer because it sounds kind of stupid. So how can we handle that? Like, what are some good ways to handle that if we get embarrassed that we got something wrong? And can we have a discussion about how we all make mistakes and we all get stuff wrong, right? Like, those kinds of social emotional parts of working in a group have to be built into the instructional time. And a lot of times teachers think that those soft skills are not worth the time, but in fact, they will save instructional time. They are very much a stitch in time kind of thing. If you spend a little time teaching the skills of working in a group, it will pay off immeasurably. All right, the third aspect of this is the child, right? Is the child. So here's what I have to say about that. School is about learning content, and it is about the methods and process by which we acquire and process that content, right? So it's not just about the content, it's also about method and process. I've written on my website about the role and importance of process, and I think this fits in that. Group work is part of that process. In fact, when they survey business owners, one of the top 3 skills that business owners want in employees is the ability to work collaboratively. So we're teaching that. So sometimes it's interesting to me that people will act as though the gifted kid is so far advanced. And that's probably true in a lot of areas of content, but that may or may not be true in some of those soft skills that are harder to learn, harder to teach, and are more important sometimes, right? So I think one of the things that we have to acknowledge is that group work is part of the process in school and in life. And if a child's preference, a student's preference for working in a group or not, unless you're differentiating for interest and you're going to let kids pick their group, but otherwise, if I want kids working in a group and I'm the teacher, your interest or lack of interest in working in the group doesn't matter to me any more than your lack of interest in learning this particular content, right? Like that if you're not interested in learning, you know, 2-step single variable problems, I cannot care about that. I can care only to the extent that I try to help you get interested in it, but that's what we're learning. And group work is the same. We're learning it. I think that one of the reasons Deborah's pointing out that kids feel differently in elementary school about group work than they do in secondary. And Deborah, I think you're spot on. I think one of the reasons is it's much higher stakes in secondary. I also think in secondary, teachers are more likely to be more hands-off in the group, like divide them into groups and let them, you know, fly, be free. Whereas in the elementary school, the teacher is doing a lot more active monitoring. And I can say this because I've taught both elementary school and high school, and I've seen it in my colleagues and I've seen it in myself. Okay, so I think that we have to make sure that the group is structured fairly, and start with that. But we also need to acknowledge that the child just needs to learn that learning to work in a group is part of what you're learning in school. And other kids may be coming to school to learn the content, and you may be coming to school to learn the process, but you both have something equal to learn. So I'm going to quote myself from an article I wrote about helping overly emotional children. And I wrote this: consider the discrepancy between the way the child is acting when confronted with these situations and a healthier way to react. So we want to actually look at that. What is the discrepancy, and identify it, right? When this happens, this is the behavior we see, and this is the desired behavior. List both. So what is the child's current response? And then what would be an ideal response that would be appropriate in this situation? And then during a calm time that would be apart from that stimuli, right? Not in the middle of it, not in the middle of it, role play scenarios with the child, where like the child gives a wrong answer in front of a group of people and feels embarrassed. Ask the child to self-reflect on how situations were handled, ways they could be handled in the future. Additionally, okay, so that's end quote, right? But additionally, the child needs another outlet to express the frustration with a wrong answer. So that may be a debrief with the teacher, that may be a journal, that may be a post-it note, that may be a fidget toy. A lot of times for gifted kids, and all people really, our emotional frustration manifests itself in kinesthetic energy. And so sometimes just giving a kid something to fidget with can help them channel that frustration and help them stay calm in their voice and speech with others. You just have to play around with what works with that, because what works for one student isn't necessarily going to work for another student. The child needs to understand that it is normal to feel embarrassed when you get something wrong and lash out. I'll give you an example. When I was a sophomore in college, I was sitting in the front row, as always, in an English class, and the professor asked if anyone in the class had heard of the OED, the Oxford English Dictionary. And I raised my hand, and he said, "What do you know about it?" And I said, "We have it at our house. Like I use it all the time." And he said, "Oh, that's ridiculous." And this is like a big class, right? And he's like, "That's ridiculous. It's like 28,000 volumes and it costs $1 million and nobody has it in their house." And I was so embarrassed. I could feel my face turning super, super dark red. I felt like he was calling me a liar in front of the whole class. And I already was kind of the over contributor. And the first thing I did when I got home was I went to the bookshelf to see, and we did. It was a condensed version, but we did have a condensed version of the OED. Seriously, the other day, I thought about it. That happened in 1986. And the other day, I thought about how I wonder if that professor is still alive. I wonder if I could find him and send him a message and let him know that I really do have a copy of the OED. It's so stupid, but that sticks with you. So we need an outlet to express that. A child also needs to learn the language of expressing frustration without turning it on other students, because it's normal to feel embarrassed and lash out, but we have to have the language of it. We have to get strategies for not lashing out at others around us, and that needs to happen outside of the group. We can't correct the child while they're in the group. One of the things that can help is mindfulness meditation. So the key point of mindfulness meditation is learning to be fully present in the moment without judgment. And so a child learning to say, "I'm feeling embarrassed right now because I gave the wrong direction. And that's kind of leading me down a path of feeling like I want to get angry with my friends in this group, but I know that they get stuff wrong too," right? Like just acknowledging it in the moment and not judging yourself. So I think Laura, who says that a lot of gifted kids like to work alone, and that's why it's important to expose them to it. Yes, I mean, I think partly gifted kids like to work alone because a lot of them think better. A lot of us think better alone. One of the really important group strategies is what I call a hybrid model, where they will work in the group for a little bit and then go back to their own desk and think for a little bit. Many of us do our best thinking alone, right? So if they can flow in and out of the group, that's really helpful. Your other point, that because they often prefer working solo, that we as teachers have the opportunity to teach them the skill of working in a group, is also really important. So the next part was not valuing the opinions of others. And that's just closed-minded thinking. At its heart, it's arrogant and it's unkind. And a child's giftedness doesn't excuse that behavior. It should be addressed as a behavioral issue, just like you would with any other student. So you do have to teach empathy, which the question already recognized. So how do you do that? And it's interesting that you can practice empathy. So I'm going to pull just one study and share. I'm just going to tell you about one study, but I think it's really valuable for this. And yeah, Laura, they don't want the competition in the group. They like to work independently. Yeah, that is part of imposter syndrome and perfectionism, right? So they did a study in the Netherlands, and they took 400 students who were like 3rd grade to 8th grade. And what they did was they presented a hypothetical question to them about a kid in the class. So half the kids were told to imagine that this was a friend of theirs, and the other half were told to imagine that the classmate was not actually a close friend of theirs. It was just a kid in their class who they didn't really know. Okay, so here's the situation. It is the other kid's turn to stay late and help clean up the classroom, but her mom is really sick and she wants to get home as fast as possible. So she's super upset about having to stay late, and she asks you if you will stay and help her. Would you do it? So what was interesting is that it very much depended on whether the classmate was considered a friend. If they were considered a friend, then the kid was willing to stay. But if they weren't a friend, they were much less willing to stay. So then the researchers decided they added another step. And that step they added was, can we practice empathy? And so what they did was, instead of asking if they would help, like instead of saying, here's the scenario, would you help? Then what they first asked kids to do was think about that other kid. Like to think about, okay, this girl whose mom is sick, how upset do you think she is? Like, how do you think she feels? Do you think she's sad? And after asking the kids to describe and rate and consider how that girl felt, then the children showed absolutely no bias in whether it was considered a friend or not. When they added in that extra step of pausing, considering how the other person would think, practicing the empathy, then they were just as likely to help someone who was not considered a friend. And I think that study, even though it's just one study, I didn't want to overwhelm you with studies on teaching empathy, but I think that one study is really useful to us because it's reproducible in classrooms very easily, where we can say to a child, even right before a group work experience, we can say, all right, I want you to imagine that you gave a wrong answer or said something kind of silly in the group. And, or wait, a better scenario would be, I want you to consider how you would feel if someone else in your group, imagine someone in your group gives a silly answer or gives a wrong answer. How do you think they feel then? Like, how would you feel? And have that discussion. And then say, so if we recognize that people feel this way, what can we do to help them feel better, right? So one of the things that can happen is, even without malice, the other kids may be inadvertently sending a pretty negative message. And by that, I mean that when she gives a wrong answer, or says something that they disagree with or don't understand, they may be like smirking or kind of laughing or jostling elbows or something. And that can be really painful. And so I think if we can teach the empathy by using that perspective piece, even if we don't use any other tool, it will go a long way. There's good research about this. I think, okay, students need to see failure as an opportunity, not an end. Yeah, sure. Especially in a group, being able to harness that opportunity is important. So that is a really important point. Teacher likes books, which I am also a teacher who likes books. So actually, if you don't know, I live stream an English class for kids. So if you have students who like to read, they can join in. You can find all the information on my website. If you go to giftedguru.com and click on English class, and we're starting this novel, A Day No Pigs Would Die. And the first class will be on a week from Friday, March 26th, and we're going to read the first 5 chapters. So if you have a kid, teacher loves book. If you have teacher likes books, if you have students who like to read, join in our class. So I think that is a really important point, is that when we have kids working in a class, in a group, and they're not, and they say something silly, one of the things that we can do, oh, your son comes to class. You know what? I thought I recognized that username. Oh, that's so cool. Oh, thank you. Okay. So, oh, that is so sweet. Thank you. I thought it was possible that some of my students might see that I was live and pop in on this, not realizing that it was, kind of geared to adults, although I'd love their feedback. A lot of the kids in that class are gifted. So, So back to Teacher Likes Books comments about like, how can groups support that? So I think that's part of what we teach the group, right? I said that there were 3 parts of this, and one part of it is the rest of class. So we can say, like, if someone gives a wrong answer, let's not just laugh about it or give them a hard time about giving a wrong answer. Let's not do that. Let's say, how did you get that wrong answer? What can we learn from the wrong answer? And maybe the answer is wrong in this scenario, but when could it be considered right? Like, could circumstances change that would make that the right answer? So absolutely love that. All right. Question 4. Won't giving students lessons or resources from the next grade level curriculum create boredom since they will see the same lesson next year? Not if their teacher the following year gives them appropriately challenging work and keeps them progressing. So if not, that needs to be addressed with that teacher. So we don't hold kids back from learning now because there might be a learning famine later, right? We're not going to worry about a potential learning famine down the road. We're going to go ahead and feed the kid nourishing food now, right? Now you're like, wow, she can come up with a metaphor for anything, right? And it's kind of true. So if we are going to, if we're going to try to make the argument that we should starve children now because otherwise they might be hungry later, that is not a good argument. So that's a problem. And I think, yeah, I mean, Laura's saying subject acceleration, 100%. So acceleration is probably the most misunderstood concept in pedagogy, where most teachers have some kind of hang up about it, and yet the research is universally positive. So if you're someone who is not on the acceleration bandwagon, I strongly recommend the Center for Acceleration at the University of Iowa, the Bell and Blank Center. You can download, they have fantastic publications. A Nation Deceived is where I would start, and then they have A Nation Empowered. But their research on acceleration is the best in the world, the best ever in the history of all time, and is worth reading. And acceleration is almost always the answer, or at least part of the answer. And I can say this from personal experience for myself, that I was accelerated and all of my children were accelerated. How do you get your administration on board with acceleration? Is that go read the data from the Iowa Center for Acceleration. Just Google A Nation Deceived, read it, distill it into a little bit, and ask them. I was wondering if we could have a little conversation about acceleration, because I think that I know how busy you are. It's hard to keep up with all of the research, but there is some really good research on it that I think could benefit our students. Could I have 20 minutes and go over it and invite them to learn more? And I think if we focus on what the research shows, it's harder for them to just shut it down. Last question. If products are differentiated and various difficulty levels, won't all students choose the easiest ones? And shockingly, the answer is no. Most kids and adults naturally gravitate to the level of appropriate challenge unless something else is going on. So if a child does do that, if a child is offered challenging work that they are capable of doing and doesn't want that work, then we need to look at whether there's been a disruption in the reward center of the brain. That can happen through excessive video gaming or screens. We can also have a perfectionistic tendency going on, which conveniently I wrote a whole book about. You can have depression or some other mental health issue. You may have a child who has an undiagnosed learning disability. You may have a child who's twice exceptional, and this is brushing up against their exceptionality. A mentally healthy child will seek appropriate challenge. So we don't need to worry that much about a child seeking easy work. Now, if the work isn't presented appropriately, then a child might choose that, right? So there we go. But in general, what I found in my experience as a teacher is that when I offer the work that is the best fit for the child, it's like Goldilocks, right? They pick the one that they like. Okay, So I need to go look through some of these comments. I'm glancing over to another computer so I can see this. Okay, I want to make sure I fully responded to Sarah with how do you get administration on board with acceleration. So I do think it's very important to start with statistics, and secondly, money. So one of the things that is a real benefit of acceleration is that it's free and it actually saves the district money. So when my school district was hesitant to accelerate my son, I wanted him whole grade accelerated. So he skipped an entire grade. They were very hesitant about it until I explained to them that if the school was spending $9,000 a year per pupil, then if they let him skip, they just saved the district $9,000. And then all of a sudden they were like, oh, wait a minute, right? Like for every year a child skips, it saves the district $9,000. And that was, a number of years ago. It's probably even more now. So I think we approach it through stats and we approach it through money. Okay. And we can, yes. Oh, Laura is so right that especially it's going to be pushback. Scheduling is going to be pushback when you are at the secondary level and the master schedule is tricky, and when you're at the elementary level and you have a departmentalized grade. And so they're like supposed to go to fourth grade for math, but fourth grade does math at a different time than second grade does math. That can be problematic. There are ways around it, but you will get that pushback. So, and then difficulty, the one thing that makes it a little bit harder for me to solve the scheduling issue in this discussion is that it's different depending on the school and how the school is set up. One of my children ended up just having to walk down the hall while his grade was doing math, and he walked down the hall to a higher grade level classroom. They weren't actually doing math at that time, but he just had a desk in that room and he would be given work and the teacher would check in on him and the teacher would give him like micro and mini lessons, and he would kind of work alone in the corner of the classroom. And he did 3 grade levels of work that year. So yeah, when administration feels the schedule is being driven by a few students, that can be problematic. But really the issue, we can reframe it, right? Which is that strong schools are agile. Strong schools have the ability to flexibly meet the needs of students. And we would never look a parent in the eye, or a lawyer and say that scheduling was making it hard for us to meet the needs of a child with an IEP or a 504, because we would be looking at a federal lawsuit. So I think one of the things that we can look at is we are flexible already. We're already agile. We're already meeting the needs of our students who need support. These are students who also need support, just in a different way. It's a good point, Sarah, that virtual learning does make that easier. I used to have to get, when I was teaching, my conference schedule set so that I could go get my kid from school, drive him to the other school so he could take his advanced class, and then drive him back. And so my whole conference period was lost driving my kid around. So yeah, it's true. Okay, I want to comment. I see some questions. I'm loving the advice that Laura has been given about how she does that, like if they score this much. And I think Laura's point is important, that teachers don't want a student in the class that has already mastered the material, because we know they're going to be a discipline problem, right? We know they're going to be bored. We know they're going to be causing problems. We know they're going to be Ferris Bueller, right? Your state may or may not have a strong gifted association. If it does not, look to NAGC, look to the national organization if your state isn't good. And then let me see here. Oh yeah, those students are going to do well on tests, which is another way. Okay, plan B, if you can't send kids to above grade class for a subject because of COVID, what's plan B? Okay, then if they can't go to another class, then they just have to have compacted instruction in the class where they are. So you're going to pre-test them, and then you're going to excuse them from the work that they've already mastered, and you're going to give them the opportunity to work independently or maybe in a very small group along with others who have mastered that same content within their own cohort without being sent to another class. So this is definitely possible. You may involve other people in this. For instance, your librarian. I have had the great fortune of working with a librarian who loved teaching, and she would help me work together with me to create projects for these groups of kids to do, small groups, and she would help guide them. So I would send them to the library and they would work with her there. So you can maybe do that, or you can maybe record some stuff for them so that they're getting instruction from you, but it's not what everyone else is doing. Next, okay, Lynette says, pro acceleration, whole grade acceleration worked well for her daughter. Do you have any tips for selling cluster grouping within elementary? So I think that cluster grouping within elementary, and if you're unfamiliar with that term, what Lynette is talking about is where, like, I'm going to use like easy to manipulate numbers here, but let's say we have 100 kids in 4th grade in a school, and we have 4 classrooms of 25 kids. We've done our GT identification and found that we have 16 identified gifted kids in the classes. So what we're going to do is we're going to put 4 kids in each of the 4 classrooms, 4 gifted kids in each of the 4 classrooms. Why do we do that? Because gifted kids need the opportunity to work together, and they deserve the opportunity to work in their thinking peers, not just their grade level peers. So why is this helpful to teachers? Why is this helpful in scheduling? Because when you have a cluster of gifted kids, then you have a couple things going on. Number one, the teacher isn't having to create something separate just for one kid, right? If I've got only one kid in my class who's gifted, it's very hard for me to justify spending the extra time to meet their needs. It feels almost like a waste of time. So there's like it's like an economy of scale kind of thing, right? On the other end, if we don't cluster group, we can end up with all 16 of them in a classroom where we've got 16 gifted kids, 4 on-level kids, and 5 kids who are identified with special education concerns. And some of those may be gifted as well. So what happens then is the gifted kids can just take over and steamroll the whole thing. And they can cause serious, serious discipline problems if the teacher has to teach the on-level content. You have to teach on-level content to on-level students. And she has to support by federal law. Unfortunately, there's no federal law that says they have to support the gifted, but there is a federal law that says you have to support the special education students. In fact, there are 3 federal laws that say you have to support special education students. So I don't know why we just can't get one. But in any event, it can be much more difficult for a teacher to do that. In addition, let's just be honest that a lot of times parents of gifted children tend to be more demanding, and oftentimes with good reason. But the fact is that if you've got a huge amount of gifted children in your class, you're going to be dealing with a lot more intense issues vis-a-vis parenting. It also, if you've got a push-in model, meaning that you've got a GT resource teacher who's trying to work with classroom teachers, it's a lot easier when the kids are clustered because for a number of reasons. One of them is that a lot of GT resource teachers are working in essentially a closet. And so if they've got, one kid and then they've got 16, it's really, really difficult. So that's how I would sell cluster grouping. But I'm going to write that down because that is a gap on my website. So I need to write that down as an article that needs to be written. How do we do that? And apparently I need to write a lot more about acceleration as well. Okay, and I agree with you, Laura, this is the easiest time to accelerate. Totally agree. What advice do you have for minimizing GT students getting distracted with other activities since they tend to not follow a linear path? Part of it is, and look, Sarah said the same thing. Part of it is that we have to look at why are they getting distracted. So are they getting distracted because they're in a distracting environment? Now, you can go back and forth about intensities and overexcitabilities, but the truth is that a lot of gifted kids are highly attenuated to stimuli. So, if you've got buzzing fluorescent lights, if you've got another kid over there tapping their pencil, if you've got all this other stuff going on, then I just saw my husband walk by. He's wearing headphones. He's like, I've heard enough of her all day. If you've got a distracting environment, you want to minimize that. I've seen one of the things that I have seen is, oh, he's watching. He just held up his phone so I could see he's watching. That is so sweet. That's like 15 points on the Good Husband Award. I mean, he's a software engineer, so this isn't like his thing. But although he was a grown-up gifted kid, you can read about it on the website. I interviewed him. So if the environment is distracting, we want to minimize that. The second thing we need to look at is, again, what I mentioned about in another answer to another question, which is mindfulness meditation, is that we can teach the kid mindfulness in the moment, learning how to be fully present in the moment without judgment, so that they can recognize, oh, I'm starting to feel distracted. Another thing we need to look at is whether the child is accurately measuring the passage of time. So this is a real struggle for kids with ADHD, but it's also a struggle just for gifted kids in general. This has been my experience anyway, is that the same thing, like an activity that takes 10 minutes or an explanation that takes 2 minutes, they only have, they feel like that lasts in an hour. And so they easily get distracted because it's just not holding their attention. And this is something that we just simply have to work through and we have to practice. So just recently, I came to this conclusion about myself with something, which is that when if I am thinking about something one way and somebody disagrees with me and they start to explain it to me and I realize they're correct, right? I'm like, oh, you're right, right? And I'll say, you're right. I want them to immediately stop. Like, I don't want you to keep going with your explanation. I want you to stop. I've already agreed with you. Can we move on? But what I realized is that, and embarrassingly, I just realized this last week when I was writing my journal about it, I realized that that is a form of impatience. And it isn't necessarily that the person just needs to say their idea. They may also have a need to share their rationale, right? That's part of their need as well. And that I need to let them finish. And so, like, I'm 54 years old, still learning that. So we want to make sure that we're teaching kids how, like, if you're getting distracted, are you getting distracted because you're not honoring what somebody else is telling you? Are they getting distracted because the activity isn't actually quality activity? So they can get distracted because it's not enough to occupy their mind, right? So it's like saying, well, I gave you a bag of chips. Why are you still hungry? Well, it didn't satisfy me. It didn't nourish me, right? It didn't nourish me. So one of the problems with addressing distraction is that there are a lot of theories about what could be causing the distraction. And if our theory is wrong, our intervention can be wrong. And so we want to make sure that we are considering carefully what is causing the distraction. So think carefully about what might be causing the distraction, work on an intervention that would do that. If it doesn't work after a while, then maybe try another intervention with the same theory. And if that still doesn't work, adjust your theory and then keep moving forward. That is not going to be something that's going to be solved lickety-split. That easily distracted is pretty common. And they will probably never grow out of it. They just need to learn coping strategies for it. And that may include like signals with the teacher, things like that, right? Like the teacher gives them a signal, or they can signal the teacher, I'm struggling to pay attention. And one of the things that helps students pay attention is proximity to the teacher, which is, I think, one of the reasons why so many kids are ending up like multi-screening during virtual learning is because there's no proximity, right? You can't force proximity. Okay, I feel like I've answered all the questions that I've seen in the chat. If you asked a question and I missed it, if I could trouble you to put it in the chat again, or if you have a question, please feel free to put it in the chat. I'm so grateful to you for joining in. One thing I am curious, and I would very much appreciate, is I'm considering making this a once a month thing, where once a month I'll just jump on and live stream it, and then the recording will be up for anybody who can't join in, and just take questions. And again, I would just solicit questions ahead of time, or or people obviously can answer in the chat or ask questions in the chat. So if you think that that would be useful, if you feel like a monthly Q&A that we can just get together as gifted land inhabitants and talk about issues and brainstorm ideas and share. I've loved seeing all of your discussion with each other. And luckily, I think maybe I even need to do this. So if you think that would be useful, then please go ahead. Burlington, Iowa. Look at Terry. She's got a Van last name, so I'm already a fan. And she's from Burlington. I used to live in Iowa. My middle son was born in Cedar Rapids. Okay, asking the questions ahead of time. I sent out an email about it. So if you are not on my email list, I'm going to put the link in the chat. If you're not on my regular email list, this is a different email list from the English class. So I have a separate email list for kids who are taking the English class. But if you are not on my regular English class, I send an email out. I sent out a couple of emails actually saying I'm going to be doing this if you have any questions, and people sent in emails. I also posted it in the Facebook page, which Facebook's algorithm, who knows if you're able to see that. But you can always shoot me an email and definitely sign up to stay in. Yeah, Lynette, I think you're right. Like, there are some people who don't have a lot of background, and then there are some of you who have a lot of experience, and it's so helpful. Okay, high IQ means in the brain. Do a session on, yeah, okay, the gifted brain. So yeah, we can definitely do that. Gifted brain. Perfect. Okay. Oh, well, thank you, Laura. I want to thank you so much for those of you who shared your thoughts and ideas with each other and made this not just a lecture by Lisa, right? So thank you for that. I really appreciate it. Okay, well, that is awesome to learn. Also curious if you have an opinion, if there is a particular day of the week that is good or bad. I know you can always watch the recording, but I am open. I picked Monday just because this was the one night I had this week. So that's it. So yeah, it's true. Deborah says, being the parent of gifted kids myself. So I like to say that I'm fond of saying I have kind of the gifted trifecta. I was a gifted kid, identified with a Stanford Binet IQ test when I was in elementary school. And then I parented 3 identified gifted children. And then I taught and teach gifted kids. So I kind of approach it from all levels. And I think that that's helpful because I can see the different perspectives. And I think that's been really helpful to me. I can remember what it was like as a child, and I know what it's like as a parent and a teacher. So that's helpful. Okay, so Wendy's saying, Wendy Clark. Okay, if you guys don't know Wendy Clark is from Washington, the wonderful Way Tag, and she is so amazing. She actually sent me a present recently. I got this email, Wendy sent you a present. And I haven't written her back yet because I haven't got the thing itself, but I did get the note. So thank you, Wendy. Okay, Mondays are good too. Okay, yes, and I'm married. I think, yeah, my husband's gifted too. Actually, I married the smartest person I ever met. He's so smart. He's so smart. And it's so nice. I think somebody asked me recently, a gifted young adult said to me, I just don't know how I'm going to find someone to marry. And I said, have them watch a Monty Python movie with you. And if they laugh, it's all going to be okay. It's like, if they get your humor, it'll all be all right. So, okay, well, I'm glad to hear. Oh, and Amanda's the trifecta too. I love it. So I'm glad to hear the feedback on that. And I then will go ahead and end this live stream. The recording will be up. If you feel like any of the answers are valuable, I'm going to go ahead. I'll go back in and edit the video tomorrow to add in timestamps. so that people can see when the different questions were answered. So if you're a gifted teacher or you want to share part of an answer with somebody, you'll be able to find it. And the live chat will also show. So you'll be able to see the other people's ideas as well. So thank you again so much for joining in. I hope the rest of your evening is wonderful. And I hope I see you in the Facebook group and on the Twitter and all the places. And next month, I'll be sending it out in the email and posting it and in the Facebook. And however you heard about this one, you'll hear about others as well. So thank you so much. Thank you. And thank you for this wonderful feedback. It's really great. So yeah, no, intelligence is super attractive. Totally, totally true. Yeah, totally true. You know what? Let me end with a joke. This really intelligent woman fell in love with this guy just based on his intelligence, but he was a total jerk. And after they got married, she realized it. And one morning she woke up and he starts in and she realizes he's a jerk. And she says, honey, will you solve an equation for me? And it was just like, it's not even a funny joke, but it's just like painful to me in that like we seek just this one thing. And then it's like, all we want is the person in that thing. Luckily I got the whole package with my husband. He's wonderful as well as intelligent. So I got lucky. So I don't ever have to ask him, just like, could you solve a cryptic crossword for me so I can remind myself why I married you? I don't have to do that. So thank you all for your feedback, and I will see you next month if I don't see you sooner.